Welcome back. My name is Elisa Boklich, and I'm the director of the Center for Philosophy and History of Science. And welcome to the 8th Annual Karbank Symposium for Environmental Philosophy. Our final speaker this afternoon is Dr. Andrew Light, who is a professor of philosophy and environmental policy at George Mason University, where he is also the director of the Center for Global Ethics. In addition, he is the director of international climate policy at the Center for American Progress, where he works closely with the Obama administration on bilateral and multilateral energy and carbon mitigation agreements. He'll be speaking to us today on the topic of international climate ethics in a time of uncertain climate policy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Light.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Center for inviting me. Ever since I was a little philosopher, really kind of like this, because I went through a growth spurt in college, so it was like this size philosopher. I always dreamt of being part of the Boston Colloquium on the philosophy of science, right? So walk by those papers, in the those big nice posters in the department. Go, what a great thing it would be to be on one of those posters. So it really was literally a dream come true. So thank you very much, seriously, and with amazingly distinguished co-panelists. So I appreciate that. And Kristen started out thanking all of you for coming out on a very nice Friday. I appreciate those of you who stayed through the entire thing for my talk, Friday, so I really do appreciate that. What I'm going to talk about is, as was mentioned in the introduction, I have these two jobs that don't often overlap. So I have to really work hard to sort of pull them to overlap these days. So what I'm going to talk about is really out of my experience, both as an academic philosopher doing the kind of work that I'm sure a lot of people who are here at the university do, but also this other kind of work I do with a very large NGO, the Center for American Progress, which was started by John Podesta, who was the last chief of staff to President Clinton and the director of the transition team for President Obama. Started about 7 years ago as a counterpart to some of the think tanks that Kristen mentioned in her talk, who I will not repeat who those are, probably know who they are. And fundamentally working through a series of interesting occurrences, now really taking the leadership on our work on international climate policy. So it's been incredibly interesting to try to do that, but also try to integrate the skills that I had as a humanist into this enterprise. So what I'm going to do in that light is I'm not going to give a talk that some of you might have expected, which is a talk where I go through some of the great work that's done by other philosophers, like my former colleague Dale Jamieson at NYU, my other former colleague Steve Gardner at University of Washington, and lay out their work on climate ethics and then dismantle it and then come up with an alternative. I think all of that kind of work, the kind of work that's being done by professional philosophers, going back to Henry Shue really, on climate ethics is extremely good philosophy, and I would say on a whole much better as environmental ethics than most of the work that's done in environmental ethics. It is, as Kristen's work is, extremely grounded in the facts of the matter, which I think is quite good. But from the perspective of the kind of work that I do on a day-to-day basis now in the realm of international climate policy, doesn't really have much to offer in terms of moving that work along. That is not, I think, because there are not ample opportunities for moral arguments in the realm of international climate diplomacy. I think there absolutely are, and I'm going to try to tease out what I think the main ones are for you by going through a quick history of climate diplomacy. And this is, in fact, what I'll do in the first part of the talk on the moral elements in climate diplomacy. But I think very much the problem that we often see with the difficulty of taking the very rigorous work that we do as philosophers and apply it to the very messy real world. I think it's important that we take the risks of getting involved in the very, very messy real world because it's absolutely essential that there be some voices in that realm who think about questions of value in something other than economic terms, which is something that clearly came across in Kristen's talk as well. So after talking about sort of distilling some of what I think are the most important moral elements that have evolved along with the history of climate diplomacy, I'm then going to talk about two things. First of all, what I think the policy future is, where we are facing right now at this very critical juncture. As of just a couple of weeks ago when the international climate negotiations resumed in Bangkok, Thailand, between, I think, the visions that were outlined, a Kyoto-style vision, which we got up a very good primer on, But the other vision that was sort of emerged, whether people liked it or not, out of the Copenhagen Climate Summit a couple of years ago. And then go from there to really making a case for what I think is probably the most important pressure point, where we ought to be applying moral leverage in this entire debate, this question at the juncture of the third part of the talk between counting carbon and counting dollars. Now, just one little bit of information to just another way of putting a kind of a point that Robert was going back to again and again in his talk, is the absolute fundamental necessity of cooperation in order to achieve some kind of solution to the problem. What that solution has come to mean, what a solution to the problem means, I'm going to give you a functional definition of in just a second, and I'll lay out the history of it later. But basically, this is a piece of data that was generated by the Environmental Protection Agency. Very few people looked at because it was about a piece of legislation that no one actually ever voted on. So this was the EPA. This is from the EPA analysis of the Senate climate bill, the Kerry Lieberman American Power Act. So as you all, I'm sure, know, the House of Representatives was successful in passing a comprehensive piece of climate legislation. Then we were waiting for the Senate to do their part. We waited through Copenhagen. They still hadn't done it. Then we waited after Copenhagen. It looked like they were getting there when you had Lindsey Graham joining John Kerry and Joe Lieberman and trying to put together a comprehensive bill. And then when Graham dropped out in May of 2010, things were looking pretty dire in terms of any hope of getting a Senate bill through, and in fact, the Senate bill was never even voted on. But one was produced, the American Power Act, and the EPA, as it is charged to do in all these cases, had to go and do an analysis, right, of exactly what would be the mitigation impact of this piece of legislation. And out of that, they ran a model that they'd never run before, which I think really is quite revealing. So what you see here is on the light blue line sort of coming up. This is another representation of business as usual emissions, where they are sort of headed. And this is using the scale of concentrations of parts per million in the atmosphere, the same one that Robert used. So we're around 380 right now. We're sort of going up now, well above, way over anything anyone would consider to be the safety margin on a business as usual path. There you're talking about temperature increases. There's a very big range there, but in the range certainly of 5, 7, 9 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, correlated with the worst climate impacts that we've been able to model using our computer models. So very sort of bad news in sort of where we're going. And then two alternative scenarios. The first one, this is the orange scenario, is in the analysis is called the developing countries after 2050 scenario. And in this scenario, the US and the other developed countries, the G8 countries, fulfill a commitment that they made at the G8 summit in Lechia, Italy in July of 2009, prior to the Copenhagen Climate Summit, where they agreed that their fair share of reducing emissions was at least 80% of cuts. And there, the baseline, 1990 or 2005, as the US uses, really doesn't matter, but basically an 80% cut, and that should be by 2050, not 3050. And that developing countries hold emissions in 2050 at 2050 levels. So this is kind of what, if the Kyoto Protocol moved forward in exactly the same architecture where it is now, where developed countries have the bulk of the responsibility to reduce their emissions, developing countries do not reduce their emissions, and if this is what developed countries were willing to do, even if they did more, even if they went into negative emissions, you'd still get this kind of growth pattern. And developing countries basically started, this is a sort of a feasible scenario, a very rough feasible scenario, and when essentially other technologies would just as a matter of course kind of take over and subsume the reliance on fossil fuels, hopefully. It's a little bit optimistic. But if developing countries just sort of went to 2050 and then they kind of stopped on a rise, then you're still getting over 700 parts per million. You're still getting quite a lot of dangerous climate impacts. Here, the optimistic scenario, which is they call here the G8 international action scenario, is one where developed countries reduce emissions to 80% by 2050, developing countries cap emissions at 2025, and return to 26% below 2005 by 2020. So this is consistent with what Robert laid out, the general idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, that rich countries have the requirement to make the biggest cuts, poor countries can make cuts later, but they will eventually have to make some cuts. And this one is basically they stop halfway to this mark, right, and then start to bend down, and that would, of course, take active mitigation action. Now, if we compare what are these scenarios, and this is just parts per million, if we compare, the EPA did a very nice, very revealing bit of analysis on what it would mean towards our goals of achieving some level of climate safety. And in the last, there's a big climate summit every year. I'm going to talk about the history of that in a second. Big climate summit every year. We've talked about Bali, we've talked about Copenhagen and Kyoto and sort of other climate summits. And in the last two documents emerged, first the Copenhagen Accords and then later the Cancun Agreements, which enshrined the idea that that climate safety effectively is defined as stabilizing anthropogenic caused temperature increases at 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. So Robert's totally right. You can't put the genie back in the bottle at this point. There's no way of going back to pre-industrial levels of atmospheric concentrations of emissions. I would sort of argue, along with many other scientists, there's no way of, short of some geoengineering solutions that are, at this point are pretty much science fiction, of making sure there's no increase in temperature levels over pre-industrial levels, because a lot of the carbon we've emitted out there persists for, depending on the source, maybe up to 100 years. If we cut down all the taps today, we've already gone over 1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial levels. We're probably committed to 2. Can we hold it at 2? Then we have a really, really different scenario. So what we've got here is the developing country delay, the developing country delay, which is they wait until 2050 to do anything, gives us an 11% chance of holding temperature increase at 2 degrees Celsius. And this is assuming developed countries do almost everything they feasibly can. But if you get cooperation, then your 11% chance at stabilizing at 2 degrees Celsius goes up to 75%. And those are the stakes that we have. That is what basically why there's so much focus on international agreement. That is why there's so much focus on a cooperative pathway to move forward, because there is a huge difference between the 11 and 75% chance, factoring in other uncertainties. Now, how are we doing with respect to coming up with a solution that can get us a 75% shot at stabilization at 2 degrees Celsius over an 11% shot at stabilizing over 2 degrees Celsius? So here are some, I'm going to give you 3 slides that give you a sense of the history of international climate diplomacy, where we are and kind of what are the most important sort of moments in it from my view. And then I'm going to go back through this again and tease out what I think are the most important moral elements of this history. As Robert said, we've got the first climate treaty was in fact one the United States did sign, which was the treaty that emerged at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which is the treaty that created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that is the body that meets every year in these big climate summits and has smaller meetings along the course of the year. The number varies in between the big meetings, where they are trying to move towards creating the architecture of a treaty. Originally, the UNFCCC, which is a very fascinating read, has a lot of interesting parts to it. But the most important, iconic phrase, and Robert was right to pull this out, is the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. Everyone has an obligation, but everyone's obligation is going to be different. Now, Robert focused on emissions history as the primary focus for how those obligations are thought to differentiate. Another very critical part of this was something that was alluded to in our question and answer period in the last session, which is also relative development status, right? So the idea that being that even countries like China and India, which are emitting quite a lot and have extremely well-developed cities and are very rich in some parts, still have hundreds of millions of people in poverty, even more people in energy poverty. They don't have access to regular sources of energy. And because of that, all of the indicators that sort of follow from those kinds of poverty indicators in terms of the impact of poverty on child mortality and morbidity, adult mortality and morbidity, just across the board are much worse. So all the things, just from a straightforward welfare view, might set priorities between the countries, are certainly acknowledged in this schema. That the countries not only that have emitted less in the past, but also have greater priorities for development, given that we can't easily switch from fossil to non-fossil mechanisms, we ought to let them continue to use the fossil mechanisms as a matter of justice. We know also that the first then treaty, the UNFCCC actually said that they thought, I mean, people, I take them at their word at this, people who wrote the UNFCCC treaty thought that it would be sufficient to solve the problem. It called only for voluntary reductions in emissions. Of course, that's not going to be sufficient to solve the problem. So the first treaty that we produced that created a mechanism that would require certain parties to reduce their emissions was the Kyoto Protocol, as Robert reminded us. And basically, these are the targets. Divides the world, as Robert said, between two buckets, the developed and the developing countries, or the so-called Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. Annex 1 countries as a whole, some have different targets, have to achieve a 5.2% reduction in their emissions below 1990 levels by 2012, so it's coming up very quick. Non-Annex 1 countries get a free pass, at least now. Now, there's the idea of the original architects of Kyoto was that at some point, hopefully before now, we would have figured out that in the next commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the one that starts in 2012 and was thought to run until the end of 2020, that commitment period would be structured so as developing countries would come in and begin to reduce their emissions in some fashion. That was the idea. But different countries have different interpretations of this, and some still to this day will maintain that the original architecture of the Kyoto Protocol must remain sacrosanct, that because of the way they interpret the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, only developed countries should be required to reduce their emissions. What developing countries do will be whatever they decide to do. Now, Robert mentioned that the United States is a famous holdout from the Kyoto Protocol, which is true. And it's important to go back to, in the history of this, to exactly when and why they decided to become a holdout. The origins of the holdout was in July of 1997, which you see is prior to when, in fact, the Kyoto Protocol was finished. It was finished in 1998, went into effect in 2004 after a sufficient number of countries signed it. A year, almost, well, not actually a year, but about 7 months before this, the United States Senate voted 95-0. I'm always astonished by this. 95-0. I mean, you couldn't get the U.S. Senate to vote 95-0 on anything. You'd say, National Cheese Day. And there'd be one guy, no National Cheese Day. That would be very bad. You cannot pick winners among snacks, right? No National Cheese Day. And the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which is only a few pages long, it's a quick read, clearly says to the Clinton administration, do not even bother, it wasn't a vote on the Kyoto Protocol, it was a vote saying, do not even bother to show us the Kyoto Protocol. We will not consider a treaty with the architecture of the Kyoto Protocol, one that divides the world between Annex 1 developed and non-Annex 1 developing countries, and then says non-Annex 1, the developing countries get a free pass. And there's different interpretations of this. I'll give you one interpretation of the rationale as it's understood in the Byrd-Hagel resolution later. An interpretation that John Kerry is very fond of using. But primarily, when you look in there, the fear is over economic competition, right? That the U.S. is not going to put itself at risk to its major economic competitors, China and India, by signing on to a treaty like this. So after that, we spent about really close to 10 years trying to figure out how do you either expand the treaty so that China comes in, especially China, but also India comes into the Kyoto Protocol, then bringing in the U.S., or how do we get the U.S. to just give up its position on the Kyoto Protocol and move forward? Now, no administration since the Clinton administration has even dared to consider, including the current administration, will not even consider bringing to Congress something that looks like the Kyoto Protocol or the Kyoto Protocol itself, because looking at this number, 95-0, think it has zero chance of ever getting through the U.S. Senate, of which I think they are absolutely fundamentally right. Finally, in 2007, when the climate summit was in Bali, a sort of a deal was struck, and this came through the Bali Action Plan. And I've got a whole talk on the Bali convention, which is extremely exciting because the Bush administration was representing the United States at the time, and the Bush administration actually agreed to this deal, which was no one actually really thought they would. And the one thing that wasn't mentioned before, why this process is so incredibly difficult, is that in fact, according to not really the formal rules of the UNFCCC, but the operationalized rules of the UNFCCC, this process operates under a consensus model. So to get something, even a political statement, out of these climate summits, you've got to have all 194 parties agree to it. So those of you who think the 60-vote threshold in the US Senate is hard, you ain't seen nothing until you've seen a process that requires consensus around 194 parties, which has led many people to be quite skeptical about our hopes of getting a climate treaty out of this. But nonetheless, all of those parties agreed in 2007 on a kind of a very crude formula which would get developing countries to agree to take some kind of reductions in their emissions, and it's called the Bali Action Plan. And out of this, they iterated the idea of what are called NAMAs, which are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. So consistent with the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, the idea was that developing countries would agree to reduce their emissions, and then people differ on whether they were agreeing to binding cuts or non-binding cuts, but agree to reducing their emissions in exchange for two things: finance, money, to help pay for this transition to a low-carbon economy, and access to clean energy technology. And that fundamentally has become to settle worries over intellectual property. Also important at the Bali Action Plan, and we'll come back to this later, is the creation of the possible home of a new treaty entirely, something that would be completely different than the Kyoto Protocol. And this was the creation of a new track in the negotiations, which is called the Ad Hoc Working Group on Long-Term Cooperative Action. Okay. So we also know one thing that was also decided at Copenhagen, or at Bali, was that the deadline for getting either a new commitment for Kyoto or a new treaty entirely, or some combination of the two, would be Copenhagen. Copenhagen would be the deadline, the Copenhagen Summit in 2009. And the UNFCCC put up a very, at first, kind of handy countdown on their website. You could say how many days, months, days, till you get to the deadline in Copenhagen. As we got closer to Copenhagen, this was not really handy. It was really incredibly annoying to every day, open my web browser and see how many days we have left to try to get an agreement. But nonetheless, that was why there was all these expectations put on the Copenhagen meeting. It really originates in 2007. Now, we can talk about this later in discussion, but there's been much criticism of the Obama administration's position. Now Obama's in power, and his negotiators are sitting there negotiating with the world on whether we're going to get an agreement at Copenhagen. All through the summer leading up to the Copenhagen meeting, the United States is not putting targets on the table for emission reductions themselves. They're not putting targets on the table for money, things like this. They're not really negotiating. Why? Because of the history of the Byrd-Hagel resolution. Because many of the people, including Todd Stern, this guy there, who is our chief climate envoy, worked in the White House under Clinton, certainly had intimate knowledge of the failure of the Clinton administration of the Kyoto Protocol, was not going to recommend that the U.S. start negotiating while the U.S. Congress was still trying to come up with a climate bill. Don't get in front of the Senate. That was the idea. But at the very last minute, the Danish host came up with this brilliant idea. And the idea was something called the two-step process. So step one, we use Copenhagen to get a broad political agreement that can have all the important components of a climate treaty, but will not be a legal thing that you got to sign. We expect anyone to sign there and ratify later. Then number two, you would follow this up later by a second step where you would sort of turn whatever you agreed to in Copenhagen into a fully binding treaty. Now, we can come back and talk about the history of the Copenhagen Accord and later if you want to, but which is what we call the agreement that emerged out of that. But basically, a few important sort of elements that came out of this. First of all, the agreement on the 2 degrees Celsius safety level. That's very good. Certainly, that was consistent with what the scientists were saying, that you at least need to get that. Unfortunately, no agreement on what the emission reductions would have to be to achieve that, either for Kyoto in the next period or another treaty. Consistent with this idea of the Bali Action Plan, finance for countries that are willing to reduce their emissions, who are not bound to reduce their emissions, the agreement of 2 pots of money, a $30 billion Fast Start Finance Fund, which goes from 2010 to 2012, which is mostly going to come from just direct government appropriations. And then a second pot of money that will start in 2020, which will be a $100 billion annual fund, like a renewable World Bank or a fund, something like that. The idea being that we would, by 2020, have a climate fund which could then really pay for all the reductions that were needed to get developing countries on board. Interestingly enough, by this meeting, China has said that they will not accept any external climate financing. You just had to, but they were willing to put up lots of fairly ambitious reductions in their emissions as goals. But the United States was very, very skeptical that the Chinese were actually going to meet their goals. Because they looked at things like, from 2008 to 2009, China had the second biggest increase in carbon emissions in 1 year in history, which was matched only by the first time that they did the same thing, which was 3 years before that. So the US is very skeptical of China's ability to meet some of its goals, and so they're demanding some kind of rigorous form of measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions from all parties. Chinese resisting that, US pushing for it, and then there was a kind of an outline of a kind of agreement on that. And finally, something here that I'll come back to in the end, which is hopefully the slides which will give you some hope on this, that give me hope, that allow me to sleep at night, a requirement that all parties who want to associate themselves with the Copenhagen Accord submit by the end of January 2010 exactly what their plans for emissions reductions are going to be, consistent with this aspiration to hold temperature increases at 2 degrees Celsius. So this is actually going to give us the most important piece of data that we have today of what the promises are to reduce emissions by most of all the important emitters in the world, in fact, most of the countries of the world. Now, the Copenhagen Accord did not go through this consensus process. 5 countries famously blocked it, so it had a very sort of a bad status in the negotiations for the next year. The US was claiming it was something you could negotiate on. Other countries who even signed it were saying that it was not a legal or legitimate treaty in this process, so that led for another depressing year. Then we move forward to last December, the last climate summit in Cancun, which was in fact a very good summit, where finally what we saw is a move away from this attempt in these meetings to try to get a new climate treaty or finally fix the Kyoto Protocol, a kind of an all-or-nothing gambit, where the Mexican negotiators under the leadership of Patricia Espinosa, the Mexican foreign minister, said, we're not going for the whole thing, we're going to go for building blocks. We're going to go for parts of the treaty and see if we can get agreement on those. We couldn't get even that in Copenhagen. We're going to see if we can get them in Cancun, and they actually did. So the first thing they did is they actually got all the moving parts of the Copenhagen Treaty, the commitments on the finance, the 2 degrees Celsius, the MRV thing. They got all that in there. They also got other parts of a climate agreement that you've got to get to solve the problem. An agreement on forestry, an agreement on adaptation is in there. So they got all that in there. They went from 6 pages of the Copenhagen Agreement to some 30 pages of the Cancun Agreements. A lot of very good text that was agreed to by all of the parties, except for one, but well, I'll talk about that in a second. So that's very good, including the creation of a green climate fund, which is going to be the repository for this $100 billion annual fund, which is supposed to start in 2020, the creation of a transitional committee, a whole new regime. There was sort of this MRV thing fell apart over the year, but it was resuscitated by the Indian government under a scheme of an idea called international consultation and analysis. One party, Bolivia, said no to the entire package, and the Mexican foreign minister gavelled through the objections at the 11th hour, at 3 or 4 in the morning of the last day of the meeting, saying that one country's objections, when everyone else is agreeing, does not count, right, as sufficient to stop the process. Actually, the same thing happened at Kyoto. One country, Saudi Arabia, objected to the Kyoto Protocol, and they were gavelled through by the Japanese host. And so then we've got a little hope breathed into this ridiculous consensus process for 194 parties. Now, here is what I take out of this history, the kind of the moral elements. These are not systematic because this is not a systematic history, obviously. No one's like building out systematically what would be, a moral argument for a climate treaty in this process. It's very haphazard, very chaotic. With these kinds of rules, it always, of course, goes to the things that are easiest to agree upon and the things that are agreed on. First of all, clearly moral priorities over obligations to future generations, clearly in there. You see it in the text again and again and again. That is the clearest open door for moral claims in this process. It's invoked many times. Of course, it's invoked badly many times and with and lots of disagreement on it, but nonetheless, it has rock solid kind of consensus. The consensus process has sort of risen as the primary piece of procedural justice. And it's not just sort of, it was a kind of interesting how they arrived at this. There's a very cynical interpretation that said, look, this was only, the US just put this in there because the US wanted to be able to object to things. There's a case for that, but those who defend it now would sort of say that, in fact, what was being acknowledged there was a notion of equivalent risk of harm. The idea being that, carbon is not like carbon pollution, if you want to call it that, is not like point source pollution. It's not bound by boundaries in the same kinds of ways, or potentially bound by political boundaries in the same kind of ways. And so the carbon emitted, if everyone else turns off the carbon taps but only China continues, then we still go in these get to these very dangerous levels of concentration of CO2. And so everyone should be able to sort of say no. If, for example, and in fact it is the case, that at 2 degrees Celsius, some countries will effectively become uninhabitable. Some of the smaller island states, at least that is in the range of possibilities. But, and so we have in both of the last two agreements language that says that the parties must get a report from the scientists, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of the feasibility of holding temperatures even lower at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which could give them a little breathing space. And that is in there, right, because of these small parties. If it was only the bigger parties, they might have said 2 degrees Celsius is enough. So that's certainly an important moral element, which you could then generalize on and then come up with other arguments about. The primary distributive justice claim is the idea of how we interpret common but differentiated responsibilities based on two things: historical emissions profile and development needs. And that gives us this rough thing that we can appeal to for what schema is best, but as Robert already told us, it's very difficult, sort of how do you calculate that? And then the US contribution to all this, and this is John Kerry's interpretation of the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which is really interesting, I should say, to watch him defend, right, the Byrd-Hagel resolution. Because he's in fact the only, well, I guess at this point there are two senators who reliably show up to these meetings. One is John Kerry, one is Jim Inhofe. When John Kerry goes, he's usually trying to help to move the process along. I will not finish my thought. In Kerry's sort of idea is something like this. The US Senate was refusing to sign on to any kind of treaty that effectively wasn't going to solve the problem, right? Any kind of treaty that doesn't bind what are becoming the biggest emitters, no matter how you slice it, moving forward. And as Robert mentioned, he sort of said, well, every time you even get a reduction in emissions in developed countries, it's not offset, right, by increases in emissions in developing countries. That's absolutely true. Last year or 2 years ago, the US emissions dropped 8%. Good news, but largely because of the financial crisis, so don't get too excited. Emissions in India went up 11.5%, effectively, even though non-intentional reduction was completely offset by the rise in emissions in India. And so the idea is something like this. It's an objection to non-reciprocal obligations based on current emissions, that if you're a big player, you've got to have some kind of reciprocal take. And that's how Kerry talks about the Kyoto Protocol and its flaws, but it's become a kind of a mantra for just talking about what a new treaty needs to look like. And it's certainly the foundation of what the US says is its condition on whether it will sign a legally binding treaty. Now there's another principle in here as well, and this is non-moral, but it's a kind of a tit-for-tat kind of principle. And this is what we get from the Bali outcome, the idea of NAMAs, nationally appropriate mitigation action, the idea that you give us this, if you give us technology and financing, then we will return with some reductions. And this is rarely, if ever, discussed by ethicists who work in this field. They really would much rather talk about the whole emissions, the question of how do you focus on the distributive justice questions, who cuts how much and when. And we'll come back to that in a second. Now, I think that this history gives us basically two kinds of futures, what I want to call the Kyoto future and the Copenhagen future. This is a bit misleading because I think that this is not really exclusive, but it will help us in framing the discussion. On the one hand, you've got the Kyoto path, right, where you either want this treaty or a treaty like it to build out from the existing treaty architecture, which is the developed and developing countries, some distinction there. And in fact, really that level of distinction, not more finer grained distinction. Some people have sort of said, look, we need at least three buckets. We need the developed countries, the developing countries, and then the major emitters in the developing world. And that should be a third separable category. Many developing countries, Brazil and Mexico, have in fact argued for a category like that. But the Kyoto path, as it's embraced officially by the Group of 77, which is the group of over 100 countries that negotiate together in all UN processes as a bloc, that insists that the only acceptable path to a treaty is using the existing treaty architecture, which other parties have already categorically rejected, at least the US has. We should focus on legally binding mechanisms as the mechanism that as a way of shaping the reductions bound by treaties. It must be legally binding or it's not worth even doing. And that the treaty obligations drive the mitigation goals. Countries themselves don't decide what they're going to reduce their emissions. The treaty sets for you what you're minimally going to reduce your emissions. And likely as well sets a limit on ambition. Because in fact, if we were to come up with a climate treaty, and we'd sort of say, look, we think this is sufficient to solve the problem, and countries signed on to it, they'd pretty much stay there. They'd sort of, we're happy with just achieving that target. Even possibly if they could achieve more, though, of course, some might go to other more ambitious mitigation levels for self-interested reasons. And the idea in the Kyoto path, which is that the way you lock this all in, the way you enforce the legally binding mechanisms is through a market. Creation of a global carbon market, which essentially makes it possible to buy out of some of your emission reductions through things like carbon offsets, so where we sort of, rich countries pay for clean energy projects in developing countries or forest mitigation projects in avoided deforestation projects in developing countries. You create a market around that, you set a price, effectively give a price on carbon, and this is how the Kyoto Protocol works. If you don't live up to your goals under the Kyoto Protocol, you're locked out of the market. That is the enforcement. Then there's the Copenhagen path, and this is kind of one interpretation of the Copenhagen path. I think that what we did in Copenhagen and really Cancun following it, because all the Cancun agreements did is take what was done in Copenhagen and really finally get it, the legal imprimatur of all these parties, says, no, we don't have to stick with this architecture. We can build an alternative architecture through the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action. We could be legally binding, but maybe it won't be. Maybe it actually won't be a legally binding agreement. If it's not legally binding, what is it going to be? In fact, what it's going to be is some kind of enforcement through shame and blame. Parties make commitments, right? And then if they don't hit those commitments, then we can shame them and say, look, you're doing very bad things. Now, you might think that counts for nothing, but in fact, it could be used as a kind of a way of an argument for refusing to cooperate with countries on non-climate issues. And I think this is, in fact, the world we're about to enter. As the U.S. continues to hedge away, if the U.S., for example, does not meet the commitments it made to reduce its emissions under the Copenhagen Accord, which I'll talk about later, we made a pledge to reduce our emissions 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. That was our commitment under the Copenhagen Accord. If the U.S. does not live up to those commitments, then other countries might shame us, call us out for it, blame us, and then refuse to do things like, I don't know, participate in peacekeeping operations around the world, or more likely, refuse to participate with us in various trade agreements because of this violation. So those are the two, I think the two paths we're going there. Now, I'll come back to later sort of what I want to say is what do these two paths mean, which one is feasible and which one is less feasible. We can leave it just the differences in the two architectures for now. If you take a Kyoto-focused agenda, then certain things in this history become important to you. If you take a Copenhagen-focused agenda, then other things in this history become important to you. On a Kyoto-focused agenda, you're really focusing here, right, on obviously the history of the Kyoto Protocol and the justification for dividing the world in these two buckets. If you take a Copenhagen-focused agenda, then you really are focusing on here, the improbability that the U.S. will sign on to an agreement that looks like Copenhagen, which looks like Kyoto, which would be extremely bad given all the reliable bars in Robert's graph. There was always that, you could count on the U.S. always being way over there, no matter how you slice and dice it. Very hard to get to climate safety without the U.S. participating, as well as the Bali Action Plan. This idea of the tit-for-tat agreement. If you give us finance and technology, then developing countries reduce their emissions. At Copenhagen, the Kyoto-focused agenda really focused on the second step, not the first step. Many countries are willing to say no to the Copenhagen Accord because a political agreement just isn't enough. It's got to be legally binding or it's not good, so you only focus on the second step. And things like these MRV things, right? Things like the rules about accounting emission reductions. Because if you're going to have a treaty that's really pushing reductions in emissions as the most important thing, then obviously this becomes critically important. Copenhagen-focused agenda, you're actually going to focus more on the conditions for meeting that tit-for-tat agreement. The idea of finance and technology in exchange for reductions in emissions by developing countries. You're going to focus on the Fast Start Climate Fund, fulfilling that, and the $100 billion annual fund. You're also actually going to focus on this, which I'll, in a couple slides, talk about, What's the results of this exercise of just sort of saying what are countries willing to do when they're not even yet in a binding treaty? Because that's likely what the world looks like, right? If we don't have a binding treaty like Kyoto, we follow one of the Copenhagen paths, then we really want to know what are people willing to do unilaterally. Kyoto focused agenda on what happened in Cancun, again focusing on MRV, a little bit of focus on the outcome, whether this process can work. And if you focus on a Copenhagen focused agenda, again you're focusing on these, the fact that the Copenhagen Accord was furthered in the Cancun agreements, but also the creation of these new institutions, the Green Climate Fund. Now, we see exactly how this is falling out. 2 weeks ago, I said that the international negotiators came back together, my friends in the State Department came back together to start this year's climate negotiations on the road to the next big climate summit, which is in Durban, South Africa at the end of this year. Essentially, in a week of negotiations, a long week, they started on Sunday, which I thought was quite admirable, starting on Sunday, and then they end on Friday. They went the entire time up until the last day disagreeing on an agenda. On an agenda, right, you went through these slides again, what your agenda is determines what's the important part, moving parts moving forward, what counts as progress moving forward. They couldn't agree on an agenda because they couldn't agree on what to talk about for the next negotiating season. And it was this Copenhagen or Cancun model versus the Kyoto model. At the very, very end, in the 11th hour, they kind of gluttons for punishment in the way they do this. They finally, after keeping everyone up for 48 hours straight, set an agenda which is a compromise, but you saw in real time exactly that happen, this kind of focus, which seems to me obviously that it's not, we're not in a sort of yet in the stable place that we need to be. Now, I would sort of argue that depending on whether you want a Kyoto-style agreement or a Copenhagen agreement, you ought to be focused on different things. Clearly, if you want a Kyoto-style agreement, you're going to focus on carbon counting. I'm going to argue that if you're interested in a Copenhagen-style agreement, which I would argue is probably at this point the more feasible agreement that we might get through, you should be focusing equally as much, if not more so at the moment, not on counting carbon, but on counting dollars. Counting the money in the flows of finance that are going through the system which might get developing countries to reduce their emissions, which is not only something that's critically needed in order to get them to reduce their emissions because of all the scientific modeling we've been talking about since Robert's talk through to mine, but also because that is where the reductions are cheaper. Two reasons. One, that's where the biggest repositories are for reductions from tropical deforestation, and the emissions from tropical deforestation and the burning of carbon from forests is roughly equal to the entire transportation sector of the planet, right? So every car, plane, moped, everything, all of that, which you can't imagine solving this problem without dealing with transportation. You cannot imagine solving this problem without dealing with forestry as well. And the places where you can get those reductions right now mostly is in the tropical forestry countries, in places like Brazil, in equatorial Africa, in Indonesia. That is where that money needs to go. That's where you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of investment. Secondly, the other thing that's important about developing countries is that they are not locked in to the bad development pathways that we have chosen, right? So Boston and Washington and New York, great cities for public transportation. Most of the cities that we have in the U.S., very bad for public transportation, right? Where I grew up in Atlanta, impossible. No matter how virtuous you want to be, almost impossible to reduce at least that part of your carbon footprint. But the statistics are incredible. If you look at the number of buildings that will be built in India by 2020 that do not yet exist, as a percentage of their current building stock, it's more than 50%. Because of the increase in population. So that is where you actually can build out an infrastructure that is not as inefficient as the infrastructure that we're building. Retrofitting is, in fact, more expensive in the long run than building efficiently from the get-go. And so those are also the cheaper places where a dollar invested in efficiency or renewable energy or infrastructure, such as a smart grid or a transportation system, is going to get you further than the emissions that you're going to get, the reductions you're going to get from the same in the U.S. Now, as I've already said here, the Kyoto-focused moral agenda gets you to focus on these questions of distributive justice. And we see, and I think I've got a kind of a more extensive example here, but I'm not going to go through it entirely because I think Robert actually already gave a very good example of this, of how it's very difficult to come up with fair ways of dividing the pie based on responsibility. For example, one of the ways in which we sort of see this dilemma is over this, how common but differentiated responsibilities is in fact interpreted. One way it's interpreted in this process, and in fact this was more or less the official negotiating position of the government of India for quite a while until Jairam Ramesh, their current environment minister, took over in that post, was basically to insist on a historical per capita equality. That's what we should do. So you take something like one of Robert's graphs, say, look, we demand historical per capita equality, and then we do a calculation of, based on your population, not how much have you emitted, but how much should you be allowed to emit into the future. And then you figure out whether or not people are drawn or overdrawn, or whether they can still draw on their ability to emit or not. It's called a carbon budgeting approach. And you get something like this. Again, I won't go into the detail here, but it's a very nifty, it's great. It's great for philosophers to play with because it's really kind of nifty the way you can attach the moral claims to the calculations here. You come up with an estimate of the amount of carbon that the atmospheric and ocean commons can absorb before we go over 2 degrees Celsius, right? Some baseline. You take that, we can go X trillion tons before we get over climate safety. You divide that X by the global population. You subtract the amount of historical emissions for parties based on some acceptable calculation, like Robert showed the different options there. And then from 2 and 3, you basically give everyone the amount that they can emit. And the result is negative emissions for countries like the US. We've way outspent our carbon budget. And for countries, developing countries, in fact, this is a natural resource of sorts, right? All these emissions that they are not yet, they still can emit, articulated in many of the analysis on this as a development right. So again, very attractive for philosophers on this. And then, of course, you get these dilemmas. The US position on this has been very clear, is really a disagreement over causal responsibility. Really just taking fairly prosaic examples we would give in terms of interpersonal relations and then applying it on this global scale. We didn't know, right, that we were causing this problem through the bulk of the history of the emissions. And some folks try to solve this by saying, look, we're not going to hold you accountable for all your emissions. We're just going to hold you accountable for your emissions since the early 70s, when, look, the science was settled, right? And then people disagree, and then some people say, oh, it should be 92, it should be the creation of the Kyoto Protocol, or the Earth Summit, and there's lots of disagreements. But the upshot, which makes it very difficult in the process, is a sort of a message. Kristen, it turns out that in addition to your bank account in whatever bank she banks in, say Bank of America, she also has this bank account in the Bank of Carbon. And it turns out that she's way overdrawn in the Bank of Carbon, and now she owes us a big check. And many people cry foul to that. There's also other worries about just on the political level, if you articulate this as a developing right, how do you sell this to the US Senate, which is already skeptical of these agreements, how do you convince them a treaty based on the idea of rights that the US has to give up? Now, you could conclude the stakes are so high, right, that we should just dig into figuring out our responsibilities, no matter how politically tricky, fix some sort of type of Kyoto-style solution, and just dig into that problem. But there's another relevant issue here that I think might potentially get us to rethink exactly whether we like this Kyoto pathway or the Copenhagen pathway, at least as I've described them, though they could be changed. And this, in fact, is the view that the government of Japan has taken up, which caused a lot of consternation at the last climate summit in Cancun. In Cancun, the Japanese, so to go back to this slide, the Japanese, who everyone thought would stick through with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the Kyoto Protocol can still, the countries that are in it can still say, we're going to go through with a new period, 2012 to 2020. We're going to negotiate new targets. We're going to do that. They can still do that. And in fact, the Group of 77, the developing countries, are insisting that they do that. Japan, who everyone thought would not pull out of the Kyoto Protocol, because after all, it's the Kyoto Protocol, pulled out and said, we will not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. And their fundamental argument was, in fact, this. The parties that are now covered in the Kyoto Protocol who are required to reduce their emissions only account for about 35% of global emissions. If all those countries went to zero, no way to solve the problem. And other countries went to business as usual. On the other hand, the countries that have signed on to the Copenhagen Accord represent over 80% of emissions. And there's very good reason to believe that, in fact, that 80% of the countries responsible for 80% of global emissions, if those countries can agree on a solution, then that will be sufficient, in fact, to solve the problem. In fact, that's a very small number of countries. It's only about 17 to 20 countries who are responsible for 80% of global emissions. And the Japanese said, why should we be working on perfecting this path? We should go with another path where we've already had a number of parties, more than the parties that are required to reduce their emissions in the Kyoto Protocol, have signed on to and said that they agree with the targets of the Copenhagen Accord and now the Cancun agreements. And here's what it looks like, coming to the end. I've been tracking with colleagues at the Center for American Progress and at Project Catalyst, which is largely staffed out by analysts from McKinsey, been tracking exactly what do all the promises that countries have been making in terms of their national plans to reduce their emissions. What does that amount to as we move forward? And in tracking that and adding it up, and then we got a big break, right, with the Copenhagen Accord because it required everyone to sort of submit a national plan, and you could really, everyone could see what they intended to do in terms of reducing their emissions by 2020. Copenhagen Accord just said, look, what are you willing to do by 2020? Here's the background that we're using to sort of figure out progress. Here is business as usual emissions, not articulated this time as parts per million, but in terms of gigatons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases emitted per year. We're now around 52 gigatons of CO2 emitted per year. We're going up to 70 by 2030 on a business as usual pathway. The Copenhagen Accord asked countries to reduce their emissions. What was your plan to reduce by 2020, not 2030? So if we're going to, an indication that we were still on this pathway would be, where are we by 2020? If we're at 61, that's kind of where we're going. In order to get down to some measure of climate safety, again, that 2 degrees Celsius target, which we'll just assume, which is controversial, that you can correlate that with this level of concentration of emissions, we need to go down to at least 35 by 2030 and then much lower by mid-century. But at least by 2020, we need to go from 61 to 44. We need a reduction of 17. Now, the Copenhagen Accord, again, asks everyone to sort of say, what are you willing to do by 2020? And so you can get a graph like this. Business as usual emissions, where we're headed, and then where we need to get to 44 to get us on a 2 degrees Celsius stabilization pathway. First good bit of news, because we did this analysis prior to the Copenhagen meeting the first time. We've run sets leading up to the last set we did was right before the last International Climate Summit in last December. So this is from the last set. Since the period right before Copenhagen, in fact, our business as usual emissions have gone down from 61 to 56. Why is that? 2 reasons. One, I already mentioned it, is the impact, the continuing impact of the economic, of the financial collapse. But also better than expected returns from investments in tropical forestry programs for the last 20 years. Better expectations we had. So we're already down to 56, a little bit of a break. When countries make submissions to the Copenhagen Accord, they divide their submissions in 2 parts. They usually say, here's what we're willing to do by ourselves, and then here's what we're willing to do if you do something, if some conditions obtain. Developing countries, the way that they put it is, here's our reductions we're willing to do by ourselves, here's our reductions we're willing to do if we get some money, if we get some finance, right? Developed countries usually put them in another form. They usually say political conditions obtain. The EU, for example, said they're willing to reduce their emissions 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. But if countries like the US were to meet a similar goal, then they would increase their ambition to a 30% cut below 1990 levels by 2020. So in the low pledges, which is just what everyone's willing to do on their own, we get a 5.5 gigaton drop if people achieve these goals, from 56 to 50. On the high scenario, if then all these deals get made, you drop to 48. So where we are on this analysis, on our chances of getting to holding temperature increase at 2 degrees Celsius, we're basically 2/3 of the way we need to be. We're not 2/3 of the way in terms of actually implemented emission reductions and policies, but we know what the promises are. We know how to keep track of them. We can, in fact, look every single year now to see whether or not countries are meeting markers that they've made in terms of reducing their emissions, as well as we can know what will be the impact, right, of political deals and finance to lower this even further. And what we've now figured out is that, in fact, you can, very easily calculate how you could squeeze out the remaining 1/3 to get us down to the stabilization pathway that we need to get to. But there's a problem, right? Because this costs money, and we know most of this is going to cost some money, consistent with the Bali Action Plan, the nationally appropriate mitigation actions. But while the emission commitments that everyone has articulated here go to 2020, there's this big gap. Remember I said there are two buckets of money. There's the Fast Start financing that ends in 2012, $30 billion, and then we have this promise of $100 billion annually by 2020. But to get on the stabilization pathway where we need to go by 2020, we need something between 2012 and 2020. So that leads me to argue that, in fact, what I think is, in fact, at this particular moment in climate negotiations, the most important issue here is what most folks have considered to be the non-moral issue here. The idea of the tit for tat, the deal for what gets developing countries where you have the cheapest chance of emission reductions to reduce their emissions. That becomes the important deal. And for that reason, and I won't go through this, there's a long way that I could have represented that. Oops, sorry, too far. For that reason, we need to focus as much on climate finance, at moving the flows, because the unilateral pledges largely for self-interested reasons. Why are these countries willing to reduce their emissions so much? Mostly because of economic reasons, right? Because they want the savings from efficiency. Kristen was talking about not only do you reduce carbon from efficiency, you save a lot of money from efficiency by orders of magnitude over the money that it costs, in fact, to implement some renewable energy plans, as well as energy security. The desire of most countries around the world, except for a small collection, to get off of sources of energy that are imported from outside of their countries. But even if you're wedded, right, to a more of an emissions-driven agenda right now, a Kyoto agenda, clearly climate finance is important because you don't drive those reductions, at least as the deal's been set up, without emissions. Now, this, I think, puts certain things in perspective. So the last two things I'm going to talk about, or last two slides. It makes what we've been through in the last 2 weeks maybe one of the most important moral battles that we're going through on climate change in the United States. Because what we're going through is the battle over the budget. And even though climate finance, the US contribution to that $30 billion Fast Start financing is originally, when the US agreed to this, was going to come in at about $4.5 billion. And then many of my colleagues in different organizations have been trying to push the US to increase that ambition. Then we have last fall's elections, and then we have the budget battle that we're going on now. And I would say equally, if not more important right now in terms of energy, the fight over the US ability to reduce its emissions is the fight over the US ability to continue to contribute to the flows of finance around the world that will get other countries to reduce their emissions. And I didn't even put in the numbers that came in through the last compromise in the last 2 days, but we can sort of see what the disagreements are like here, what President Obama wanted in some of the big climate funds in the UN, what the House Republicans proposed we should see in the climate funds that are distributed through the World Bank. That is where I think that the fight should go. And this is not to say that the tit for tat, the NAMA thing, is not the non-moral principle. There aren't moral dimensions of it. There are. It means that in terms of fulfilling our global obligations, our moral obligations, our obligations to keep the process going, even while we struggle to come up with a treaty that's workable, that really where the fight should equally be, if not more so be, in this fight over keeping the finance flows going. If you want to read more about that, we wrote a big report on this, which has nothing to do with, has no strong moral claims in it at all. But this is really the background to it, which is a report we published right before Cancun on the importance of climate finance and the feasibility of getting those reductions. So thank you very much.
So I have a question about the finance. So I noticed a lot of your graphs reference the McKinsey report that show that it's possible to save money and energy and carbon emissions simultaneously. So if these conservation opportunities exist, and I believe they are, how does financing really solve that if these things pay for themselves anyway? Is it more behavioral nudge than money that's required?
I mean, it depends on whether you're talking about a developed country or a developing country. So absolutely, efficiency gains should be, right, should be no-brainers because they pay for themselves over the long run. Now, there is a debate on that. There was a very famous, very now notorious article that was published in the New Yorker just, I guess, a month ago. And it's been followed up with a study by the Breakthrough Institute, which they've been pushing around Washington very strongly, sort of claiming that really, no, there's this paradox, right? Because the more you gain in efficiency, if you lower the cost because of efficiency, then people just use more power. That's fundamentally what's thought to be the problem. So there is that kind of contrarian answer, which I think that really, if you dig down into it, the studies don't reveal what the claims are being made. But I do think that's right in developed countries. Developing countries, though, really, I mean, it often can, of course, be cheaper to build something that's less efficient than it is to build something that's more efficient. So, you know, if you're going to be building out housing stock in a very poor country, in a country that per capita is very poor still, India, then, you know, obviously it's very cheap. It can be cheaper. In the long run, certainly maybe not, but at least in terms of the initial outlay of capital, we see this again and again and again. People are not willing to spend the money that's needed. Maybe they don't have it. And that is why it's important, right, to be able to prime that pump, to get the flows of finance going internationally, to make it so you say, look, all right, because you didn't cause the problem, the historical emissions argument, right, because you've still got other development needs, other things you need to be spending government dollars on right now, which have nothing to do with infrastructure, but, you know, that in fact are on education, on healthcare, other things that to fulfill your development needs, we're going to help you on that part. We're going to provide those mechanisms. Now, in the long run, I think that, in fact, this becomes a win-win for everyone, though it's very difficult to make this argument, more difficult than you'd imagine it takes to make this argument, that, in fact, you're also creating investment opportunities, right, for developed and developing countries by building out more efficiently in developing countries.
We've talked, a couple of the papers have touched on the question of economics and money and the contribution to this debate. And I wanted to talk for a second about incentives. I remember not too many years ago when everybody was worried about how to get people to invest more money in their 401ks, and there were all these biases in human nature that led us to procrastinate and to be overconfident about the future and such. And behavioral economics has really revolutionized our approach, if people would listen, to contributions to 401ks. I wonder if you're aware of any work that's been done in behavioral economics about this, about how you get, because we're really talking about incentives and about how you get people to cooperate for everyone's good, but to make it, to realize that it really is in our own individual interest to do so. And I just wonder, as we've come back again and again to the question of money and incentives and cooperation, whether you're aware of any work that behavioral economists have done to study how we could get to a negotiated agreement.
I don't know of any work in behavioral economics on that kind of question, and I'm speaking completely out of school. I mean, what I have read in behavioral economics is more focused on individual decision making rather than these big collective action problems, or they kind of help to explain collective action problems, but they don't really, so far as what I have seen, doesn't address this level of state-level decision-making, which is the arena we're talking about. But there may be stuff out there that I just don't know about. That is exactly the framing that we put in our report. So, you know, if you're going to talk about climate finance, you could say, you could put it, you know, kind of in something like this. This is a pretty good, good way to sort of, it could be something like this. Rich countries, pay your debt. Shame on you. You must pay your debt. And rather than being a carbon debt, but a financial debt, you know, and you can get an analysis, you can get an argument like this out of that kind of the the carbon budgeting approach that I briefly outlined, right? Do a calculation. Rich countries, you owe money now to developing countries to get them to not, right, emit. And it's a sort of a payoff kind of thing. We articulated it more as a sort of a question of interest. You know, not because I fundamentally have a problem with the analysis, right, of the sort of the carbon budgeting approach. I mean, I think that I think the analysis is quite valid. I just don't think it's a winner politically at all. That what you got to do is you got to make an argument from self-interest. In this case, the self-interest of the country. And so this report basically leads with all these national security arguments, right? You know, global financial arguments about why the U.S. will be in a losing position. Number one, if the world doesn't achieve some measure of climate safety, so the kind of the scenarios that Robert was talking about, what the U.S. loses if we don't get a cooperative solution. But number two, the investment opportunities that the U.S. loses out on if it does not get into the market of creating these opportunities. And that has become, for good or for bad, I mean, I would say that the two main arguments that were used to try to get the climate legislation through the Congress was, number one, jobs. It was a big green jobs argument. Number two, there was a big argument about energy security. The third most important argument in terms of people actually making it was the competitiveness argument, that we're letting China, and we are letting China, completely outrun us, right, in terms of producing all the stuff that's going to fix the problem. So they've captured the global market in wind turbines, they've captured the traditional market in solar panels, they're aggressively moving in other areas. The U.S. is falling far and far behind, except with the one exception of parts of the country like this, like the Northeast, because there is a carbon market in the Northeast, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So this has become a safe haven, a very small safe haven, for some of the countries that were started up on the promise that the U.S. was going to create a market that would get us into this role. But already you're getting companies, U.S. companies now, relocating to China, because there they can actually have an economic system that supports a business model, the kind of business model for producing the things they are. So the climate investments thing. So I think that becomes some way of kind of, without the exact tools of behavioral economics, we're trying to capture the spirit of that in this report.
So I just wanted to say there are behavioral solutions to this. And so there's a startup that started across the river that's people familiar with O-Power. So one of the things that utilities have to do is reduce their sales of electricity, and it's really hard because people don't pay any attention to their electric bills. But what these people figured out was they took your bill, they compared you to demographically similar houses, and they put either a smiley face if you were doing better than your neighbors, or a frowny face if you were doing worse than your neighbors. And people thought this was ridiculous, but it actually turned out sending out those bills with those little faces on it generated savings in electricity consumption in ways that energy prices did not. So there are all these neat little nudges. That do get you a long way.
And I think it was the Dutch or the Danes, I can't remember who, actually took that idea and actually put it into meters, so that your housing consumption, right, you'd get a little smiley face or a frowny face depending on where you were in terms of, relative consumption on a day-to-day basis. Kids loved it. I mean, they would like run around the house, like turning off stuff until the face started smiling. So things like that can actually make a difference.
Your presentation seems to suggest that everything is going to be about the interests of individual nations, personal interests of how they negotiate. John Rawls has an interesting idea in his book, Justice, the Veil of Ignorance argument.
Yep.
And I'm getting the sun right. Should I go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm well aware of the veil of it. I did go to grad school in philosophy, so I do know the veil of ignorance.
So has anybody tried to model that on this? For example, you bring people in and they're not supposed to know exactly which country they identify with. Yep. There's a veil of ignorance. And then you try to operate with some moral assumptions, like, you know, you don't make the worst off worse off, or things like that. Are you aware of any effort to try to model that for a solution?
Yeah, Clark Wolf at Iowa State University has probably done the most work on applying a Rawlsian framework to climate change generally. And the problem is the problem that you'd imagine. I mean, the veil of ignorance is very good for getting you an idea of what would be the best just outcome. Not very good in terms of going into a room of climate negotiators and saying, okay, everyone, imagine, right? You don't know whether you're going to live in Bangladesh, right, or Bahrain, right? You know, and you know, that's just kind of a non-starter. So we've got to, that's very good for getting up to what we think are the right outcomes, but not very good as a terms of a practical tool, right, for getting people to negotiate the right kind of treaty. But I think that that is, you know, but I think that that is, that doesn't mean that those kinds of models aren't absolutely essential. Good things we can have in mind to do that. Now, I'll tell you about one of the things that I'm doing as part of my CAP side of my job, the Center for American Progress side of my job, is working. I've been leading the research team for supporting a Track 2 process between the U.S. and India. And the Track 2 process is when states are having trouble negotiating with each other, they often will appoint, you know, proxies to negotiate for them. The most famous example of a Track 2 process, if you're not familiar with the term, is the Oslo Accords, right, between Israel and the Palestinians. And after a completely disastrous meeting between Hillary Clinton and the Indian Environment Minister, Jairam Ramesh, early on in the Clinton administration, knowing that, especially because of this, what you think is a just outcome was such a bad, gets you to such different views of whether progress is being made. They both asked for, created a Track 2 process, and I'm supporting that process. And one of the first things we did is said, okay, look, using whatever model you want to use, whatever your idea is, it's important that we all articulate what we think is the fairest just outcome for whatever reason. But we probably shouldn't try to then bridge the gap. We don't start by trying to bridge the gap between what you think is the fairest outcome and the reasons you have for it, and what I think is the fairest outcome and the reasons that I have for it. That is almost impossible to bridge that gap. What you can do, though, is articulate that, the reasons for it, and then put it on a shelf. Put those ideas on a shelf, know that they're there, go back and start negotiating very practical things about, say, technology cooperation, on U.S.-India cooperation on, you know, I don't know, the solar sector, or as we're doing a piece on now, using open source models to create platforms for clean energy technology, which different parties are going to like for very, very different reasons, right? But they might, at the end of the day, say, the outcome accords with my notion of what a just outcome will be. And that's kind of what we use those kinds of conceptions of justice in this process. As the, you know, that's your starting point, we know what it is. Now we're going to go back and we're going to get an outcome and see if it accords with very different notions of just outcome. And you can't get that for everything, obviously. But it's important, that is how you make progress, right, on the stuff that can be agreed upon from very different notions of justice.
I think you mentioned earlier that the carbon emissions in the United States have decreased by 8% last year, or something like that.
Yeah,
yeah,
it was actually 2008 to 2009.
Yeah, so, and then that obviously was for contingent reasons, right, because of the recession. And
right.
That prompts my question, which is really, I guess, a kind of a political question, but you seem to be in the thick of this, which is, you know, how is it that so many people in the United States and so many of their representatives have reached the point where apparently I'm not sure if they don't think there is climate change, or that if there is, it doesn't make any difference, or if there is, it's not anthropogenic, you know, there's no,
right.
Yeah, you know, to the point that when Obama gave, I think it was one of his State of the Union addresses, he mentioned the word climate change, you could hear the guffaws in the chamber of incredulity and sort of contempt. And he said something like, well, if you don't believe in that, maybe you believe in jobs. Which is, you know, which they do believe in. But there's something, you know, morally deceptive about the switch from, you know, talking about the issue of our obligations to the unborn, right? To, well, you want a job? Well, you know, Chinese are getting ahead of us, right? That's really,
right.
Yeah, so you better invest in it now. And then that way, getting the result that you want. it may be that that's how we have to go. But I'm wondering, like, how did we get ourselves into a position where is it the fact of climate change, or whether it matters is not believed in by, I guess at this point it's the majority in the House of Representatives in the nation's capital? It's stupefying.
It certainly is the majority of the House of Representatives in the nation's council.
So how did that happen?
I mean, we've done, a colleague of mine, Brad Johnson,
Yeah.
ran the analysis on the 80, new freshman Republican, and
Yeah.
claims he claims that all of them are climate skeptics. I think there's big differences there. The ones that are, ideological about it, and the ones that are just kind of like not curious about it and so dismiss it. How we got there that's a long discussion, but let me just say a couple things that might be informative, and then point you to a really interesting resource for this.
Okay.
The how we got there, the high point of the American public's, the bad news on the House of Representatives, good news still in terms of the U.S. public, which not only majority believes still climate change is real, caused by humans, will cause bad outcomes. You can describe the policy solutions in many different ways to them, and they agree with the policy solutions as well, right? Different ways of describing cap and trade, different ways of describing carbon taxes, different ways of describing what we're resorting to now at the federal level, though the states like Massachusetts is doing a lot in terms of cap and trade. At the federal level, the only recourse we have now is direct regulation by the Environmental Protection Agency, and so but even the public supports direct regulation by the EPA. Now, the high watermark for public confidence on climate change was in 2007, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. There's no one single reason. Al Gore's movie had a very big impact, and in fact, Tony Leiserowitz at Yale has a great piece of work where he actually sort of has some surveys that were done about the impact of An Inconvenient Truth on undecided people on climate change. Katrina had a big impact on that. There were other things like this. My colleague Joe Rome, who runs our blog Climate Progress, which is an amazingly good resource, he's a scientist, PhD physicist from MIT, former Assistant Secretary of Energy for Renewable Energy, and now a full-time blogger. Joe understands the confluence of the science, the policy, and the politics better than anyone, I would argue. Joe says, look, it fundamentally comes down to when the media was writing about it. The correlation is between public confidence in the science of when the media was writing about this after they'd stopped writing about the story as a he said, she said argument. They'd gotten over that, and that was really what you saw. And then you've got dips. Some people would say there was a dip because of ClimateGate. Some people, where there was this, right, if you know what I'm talking about, criticisms of the IPCC report over a couple of small mistakes in an extremely large report that caused this. Other things came along. I fundamentally have always maintained that, at the bottom of it, what could have really held the line on this and been a challenge, at least in the election, still, though it could have been swamped by other issues, is if the administration had championed climate science in their fight for climate legislation. They didn't. What they championed were, what I said before, green jobs, energy security, competitiveness. They did not talk about the science. And they didn't talk about the science because they had polling that showed that really wasn't the winner. That wasn't going to go there, and some worries that, look, the misinformation that is put out there every single day by a lot of folks that is their job, is to I don't believe that all the people who are making arguments skeptical about climate science necessarily agree with those arguments, but that's what they're doing every single day. That sort of claim, they just thought they couldn't win. They couldn't really clearly see how they were going to win that argument. And that was terrible because you didn't have the president using the bully pulpit to say, look, at the end of the day, it's not just about self-interest, it's about what's going to happen. And the reason we think it's going to happen is because we have the vast majority of scientists around the planet agreeing on this. And so that was a misstatement. And there's a lot of issues that will come out when people write the histories of the Obama administration about the fights inside the administration on how to talk about the science. Because there are some great scientists in the administration, John Holdren, Stephen Chu, Jane Lubchenco, head of NOAA, who would have been great delivery people on those messages. So I think that has been one of the biggest problems in terms of American confidence on that. And then there's, I think, the other side of it is that there is an argument that the solutions that were proposed then started to ideologically divide the country. So if cap and trade is the solution you want, if you disagree, it became ideologically divisive between Republicans and Democrats. And then climate became part of a larger package of things to now complain about, right, on this. One thing I've discovered in this session is that I think Kristen and I have the same father, as far as I can tell. So from her brief description of him, you know, and my father, you know, over 70, white male, gets most of his information from Fox News and talk radio, right? And you can determine with absolute accuracy what someone getting that information is going to say about climate change. And here's the resource. Ed Maybach and Tony Leiserowitz. Ed Maybach is a pollster at George Mason. Ed Maybach's at Yale. They've been running a series of surveys under the general name the Climate Change, the Six Americas. So what they've done is they've taken polling that they've done, multiple polls over 3 years, and then divided the American public into these 6 groups, from the alarmed to the totally dismissive. And then you can actually see those groups contract and expand with different things that happen, right, with that. Now, the good news about that is you can also imagine, you can also test arguments that might work to get more people into the worried kind of view. So.
Yeah, so if America was to somehow agree to an emissions cap for ourselves with the rest of the world, how could our government possibly regulate this? Surely the cap would need to be respectively divided amongst our country's corporations, but the government is obviously an energy-producing entity in itself. So isn't there an unavoidable conflict of interest here in setting up any sort of system like that?
Well, the two good pieces of news: the U.S. has agreed, has set a limit for itself. The U.S. in January 2010, when all these countries had to submit, you know, what are your plans consistent with 2 degrees Celsius? The U.S. said, we're willing to reduce our emissions 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, which is a number they pulled out of the House of Representatives climate bill. We can do that by 2020, but they said it's contingent on passing legislation. When the climate bill collapsed in the U.S. Senate, the climate negotiators immediately said, they went to these interim negotiations, it was in Bonn, and they said, we stand by our commitment even though the legislation has collapsed. Now, how will we get there? We'll get there using 3 different means. Number 1 is what the states are doing. I mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's a much bigger program starting up in the western states called the Western Climate Initiative, which will be the second biggest carbon trading system in the world after the European trading system when it goes fully online, which also includes the most populous Canadian provinces, so it effectively also will be international. Number 2, we'll do it through EPA authority. One of the first things the president did is he did what George Bush promised to do in 2000. When George Bush was running for office, he said that he would regulate CO2 using the Clean Air Act, right? And then 4 months into taking office, reneged on that promise. The Obama administration, immediately upon coming into office, ordered the scientists at the EPA to begin what's called an endangerment finding to determine whether or not carbon counts as an endangerment to human health and the environment, the same way which gives the EPA the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate other substances like mercury, right, and sort of dioxins, for example. And they went through that process, and they determined, and it was announced during the Copenhagen meeting, though no one paid any attention to it because we're all in Copenhagen, and the finding was complete, and yes, carbon is an endangerment to human health and the environment, so now the U.S. would regulate it. Now the Clean Air Act does not give the president the option of regulating CO2. It requires him legally to regulate CO2 once that happens. It's a very good piece of legislation. So now the fight we're in is defending the president's authority. So there were 5 separate, 1 bill and 4 amendments that we worked very hard to prevent going through the U.S. Senate 2 weeks ago, which would have stripped the EPA of authority to regulate carbon, reversed the scientific decision. We won all 5 of those fights. There were multiple writers to the original House Republican budget which would have stripped the EPA authority. We've got all of those out of the compromise budget that's passing this week. So we preserve that authority, and that's going to go through. And the third way that will meet our 17% obligation is through smaller pieces of legislation. The most important one of those is the one that the President announced in the State of the Union, where he said of the 3 priorities for investment moving forward that he's going to defend, education, infrastructure, and energy investment, and specifically clean energy investment. And he argued then that to give that legs, the U.S. needs to set a goal of having a clean energy standard where 80% of our energy would come from non-carbon polluting sources by 2030. So that's the current goal, to get that thing passed through. Now, unfortunately, you can get there, depending on how you argue, depending on how you count it, using nuclear, using a lot of nuclear, if you want to. So there's a lot of still uncertainties about this. But that is that's how you're going to get there. And then I think that the problem is, and you kind of identified it, is that it's a very messy way of getting there, right? Because it's going to be hodgepodge. It's not going to have every part of the economy share whatever pain there is equally, which is what a national piece of legislation would do. It's going to be very lopsided because of the way we are. But I think that's kind of where the U.S. is stuck for a while.